Hello and welcome to Section 3 of the Cold War Begins from 1945 to 1942 for the American pageant. Today we're looking at Cold War Congeals to the alleged communists. Last time we did this, we left off on the Berlin airlift. The Soviet Union, not liking the consolidation and the unification of West Germany, isolated Berlin and cut it off from all supplies. And so President Truman, instead of giving up Berlin to the Soviet Union and the communist Soviet bloc, ordered the airlift for 10 months of supplies to the German citizens. If the Soviets shot down any of his planes, it would be an act of war and give the United States cause to go to war with them. And so that's kind of the first showdown of the Cold War and then where we're at this time. So Truman follows the advice of George F. Kennan. He was working for the State Department in the Soviet Union, sent the famous long telegram to the United States, to Truman, about how to deal with the Cold War, how to deal with the Soviet Union and what the Soviets want. And the idea initially was to contain them, not try to destroy it, but contain it. Don't let the Soviet Union and the communist bloc grow. And so that's the idea. The Soviet Union must be contained. And so that becomes the cornerstone of the foreign policy for about the next 50 years, which is the Truman Doctrine. In March 1947, the U.S. said that they would help any nation resisting communism. So that's the Truman Doctrine. Like I said, was going to, and we would help any nation that was resisting communism. The idea that there was communists trying to overtake the countries of Greece and Turkey, and they were desperate and they needed some help. And so it gave the United States the excuse to get in and help in those countries. Europe, being damaged severely from World War II, was susceptible to radical ideas like communism. In the 1930s, people of Europe were desperate. They turned to fascism. And so the idea is, they needed to help Western Europe. They needed to rebuild this area, rebuild the economy so people are not desperate. They're not starving. They're not out of work, and turn to radical economic and political ideas like communism. And so Truman comes up with the idea of the Marshall Plan, which he attached Secretary of State George Marshall's name to it because he didn't think Congress would pass it if it had the Truman name on it. And so war-ravaged Europe was susceptible to communism. This is where I use an analogy. I did lawn care for a long time in the summers for about 15 years. I sprayed and fertilized lawns. And the best way to prevent weeds in your lawn, weeds, we're going to use the analogy, weeds are communist, is not to kill them, not to burn the lawn, not to, spray them with Roundup. It actually is to have a healthy lawn. If you fertilize and nurture and water the lawn, it suffocates any weeds from coming up. So the way to stop the spread of communism is to fertilize the economy of Western Europe, to basically allow these economies to thrive, to help them make money until people are happy, they're satisfied, they don't turn to radical ideas like communism. And so this is the proposal to give massive aid to rebuild Europe. From 48 to 51, the United States gave $12.5 billion in aid to 16 nations in Western Europe. You can see most of it went to France and to the United Kingdom. Italy saw a substantial amount, so did West Germany. And if you notice, none of the Eastern Bloc took the money. We did offer it to the Soviet Union. They said no. And so this is really a Western European thing. They offered the Soviets, if they made political reforms, if they allowed elections in Poland and stuff like that and accepted outside controls, the Soviets obviously denied it. So this is a where to 1947. New American foreign policy, aid to Greece and Turkey. Uncle Sam is walking blindly. This is unprecedented. The United States is, on the world stage. It's helping out. It's leading the world at this time. That's different than any other time in American history. This is the amount of aid flowing out from the Marshall Plan: $35.3 billion to Europe, $0.6 to the Near East and Africa, $1.1 billion to Latin America, $1 billion to Australia and the Pacific areas, and then $8.9 billion to Japan Japan. And those were really to developed nations. They kind of ignored the developing countries, and so that's kind of a controversial thing that we'll get to a little bit later. This is what Europe looked like after World War II. And so that you can see that the people living in these areas, they're desperate. This is not the way they live. And so the United States had to help rebuild this. This is 2 years. This is Stuttgart, which is a German city that was bombed. This is 1947. I know it's a little grainy, but 1947, this was the destruction of the urban centers following wartime bombing. And then if you fast forward 8 years, this is what it looked like and it worked well. It changed public relations. It changed how the world viewed the United States. And it helped the Western European economies thrive and do well, and became powerful allies of the U.S. in the Cold War. To add a little fuel to the fire, you have the Middle East. Middle Eastern oil was crucial to Europe and America. So, despite threats from Arab nations, President Truman officially recognized the newly created state of Israel on May 14th, 1948. Israel was created as a homeland for the Jewish refugees who survived the Holocaust. It was very controversial. Israel was carved right out of Palestine, people living there. Initially, the plan for the United Nations was to include a country for the Palestinians, for the Arabs or the Muslims, and a country for the Jewish people, for Israel. Jerusalem, which is a holy city for three religions, it's the city that it has the temple for the Jewish religions. It's the city that Muhammad ascended into heaven from for the Muslims, and Christ was crucified and resurrected in Jerusalem for Christians. Jerusalem was supposed to be an international city that no one owned. Didn't happen. Basically, Jerusalem became part of Israel the day Israel declares independence. All of their neighbors attacked them, and Israel really does well, largely because of the alliance with the United States. The U.S. saw it as a partner in the Cold War in the Middle East. And so their guns, their weapons, their training, their money, their aid largely comes from the U.S., which creates a lot of hostility in the Middle East towards the United States and Americans across the globe. This is a picture. This is the Marshall Plan turns enemies into friends, 1950. Basically, this is a propaganda poster saying, hey, we're rebuilding Berlin with American money. You can thank America for this. This is Soviet propaganda here, showing basically the cash is leading Europe away. Basically, the chariot of the U.S., President Truman, is basically trying to buy off friends across the globe. And so in 1947, because of the Cold War, the Congress passes the National Security Act, creating the Department of Defense. This combines the heads of each branch of the military, were brought together in what's called the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The National Security Act established the National Security Council, the NSC, and the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, kind of an infamous one there. And then eventually they create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which I like to do a little gang sign right here, NATO. See the N? Basically, the United States formed this pact, this group, this posse on April 4th, 1949. 12 nations pledged to fight for each other if one was attacked. Basically, if you attack any of us, you attack all of us. The United States in 1949 has the ace in the hole. They have the atomic bomb. So Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc, don't mess with England, don't mess with France, don't mess with West Germany, because you get the United States involved. It grew over the years. They added Greece and Turkey in 1952. They added West Germany in 1955. And Soviets, in turn, when West Germany joined, formed their own group, the Warsaw Pact. Here's your Warsaw gang sign, very similar to the West Side. 1955. Pro-communist group, and everything in the green there became the Warsaw Pact. And it was a very, very similar thing. If France went to war with Poland, then you get the whole NATO and Warsaw getting each other. It sounds a lot like World War I. I'm not sure that they figured out that alliances were bad, but it worked for the Cold War for the most part. This is a 1948 political cartoon reaching across the Atlantic, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which is still around today. While this is going on, they're democratization, that's a hard word to say, Japan. General MacArthur, the guy that I shall return from the Philippines, takes over and helps Japan convert into democracy. The Japanese, after their government surrendered, they were docile, they were peaceful, there's no rebellion, there's no revolt, they cooperated with his plans, they saw him as kind of he's the persona of the United States in Japan. And so in 1946, there was a MacArthur-dictated constitution that was adopted. And from 46 to 48, the top Japanese war criminals were tried in Tokyo and largely, put to death or thrown in prison. The big shock to the United States about, the Cold War and communism was communism finally takes root after a long civil war in China when Chairman Mao Zedong and his communist forces drive the democratic armies of Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan. So Chiang Kai-shek, or Zhang Juexi in the Chinese language. The U.S. does not recognize mainland China as the legitimate government of the entire country. So Chairman Mao's government was not recognized. The U.S. recognized the government of Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek as the government for the entire country. It'd be like recognizing the Hawaiian state government that rules over all the United States. 1/4 of the population at this time in the world was under communism. This was kind of a shock, a jolt, that, hey, the most populated country in the world is now communist. Many people, especially Republicans, blamed President Truman for this. They blamed him for being soft on communism in 1949. There's a lot of criticism of that going on. The Soviets explode their own atomic bomb in 1949. And so because of that, the United States decides to start developing the hydrogen bomb using nuclear fusion, where they're going to fuse atoms together and create explosions that are just terrible, and radiation is astronomically worse than the atomic bombs. The H-bomb development was actually opposed by Oppenheimer, the guy who worked on the Manhattan Project, and by Albert Einstein. The United States exploded its first hydrogen bomb, or H-bomb, in 1952. It's a thermonuclear weapon. The Soviets had it the very next year. These bombs were 450 times more powerful than the Nagasaki bomb. And so then both sides have a race to see how many they can get. And so now this rivalry that's been going on, and there's been rivalries throughout history. You have, the Romans and the Carthaginians, and go back even further, Athens and Sparta, the Greeks and the Persians. You can go into the Middle Ages. You have the British and the British and the French. This is scarier. This rivalry, these two countries have the possession, the ability to destroy civilization, to destroy mankind with these terrible weapons. This is what the hydrogen bomb looked like, with this distinctive mushroom cloud. Some really good declassified videos about these. If you can watch, find them. This was one that they exploded in Nevada in Area 51. This is Las Vegas. This is an atomic weapon that they tested there. This is declassified stuff that's available. Really remarkable to see the destruction that's going on. Don't have time to do this. And then lastly, because Truman was charged with being soft on communism, in 1947, President Truman launched the Loyalty Review Board to investigate the possibility of communist spies living in the government, working in the government. In 1949, 11 communists were sent to prison for violating the Smith Act of 1940 for supporting the overthrow of the American government. The ruling was actually upheld by Dennis versus United States in 1951. In 1938, the House Committee of Un-American Activities, or HUAC, was created to investigate subversion during basically when World War II was coming, opposition to the government. In 1948, that kind of pivots into an anti-communist group, the House of Un-American Activity Committee. Congressman Richard Milhouse Nixon, pictured here, led the conviction of Alger Hiss, prominent ex-New Dealer, became accused of being a communist. People across America demand loyalty oaths. In 1950, Truman vetoes the McCarran Internal Security Bill, which authorized the president to arrest and detain suspicious people during an internal security emergency. They're trying to give more power to basically hold suspected communists. And you get the beginning of the second Red Scare. Congress overrode his veto. They passed the bill, and so they could arrest people for being suspected communists. And then the big shock was in 1951. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were convicted and sentenced to death for stealing American atomic bomb secrets and sharing them with the Soviet Union, which led to the development of the Soviet Union's own atomic bomb and hydrogen bomb. The judge, when he sentenced them to death for treason, and they maintained their innocence, said that you've committed crimes worse than murder. Basically, that you've put the entire nation at risk. That's all I have for today. If you have any questions, let me know. I hope you enjoyed this and learned something.